Tom Hartman radio and TV program, and John in Scottsdale, Arizona. Hey, John, welcome to the program. What's on your mind?
Hey, thank you very much. I am opposed to the mosque and the insurgence of Muslim upon our society, but not for the same reason that I hear everyone talking about on all the radio programs. I'm not anti-Muslim or against the mosque because of terrorist concerns. That's going to happen whether they have a mosque or not. My whole concern, and of course I understand there's nothing that can be done about it, is I wish I could remember the author's name who talks about the 5 cycles of any civilization or society that eventually burns itself out. The 5th phase being apathy, which I truly believe our
what you're talking about actually is a long viral email that's attributed to a 19th century Scottish economist who actually didn't say what that email says.
Well, in conjunction
and history doesn't demonstrate it, by the way.
Okay, well, I guess I can't prove that at this time, but it's very debatable. As is the new thoughts about the propagation rate of various societies and civilizations, with Muslims being the highest propagation rate, and those at the lowest will eventually extinguish themselves with the Muslims taking over. Now,
maybe not. I mean, if you're talking about birth rate and that's the debate that's happening actually in several European countries right now, particularly in France and in Denmark and in Germany. I think frankly what's happening, those countries, the problem that they have is that those countries have traditionally identified themselves as themselves because of their genes. We're Germans because we've been genetically living on this. Hitler, his whole thing was Blut und Erde, blood and earth, and the soil. This is our, and the French, we're the French. We've always been, and so when people come in who look different and who have a different religion, it's like, oh my God, there goes our world and our culture. America was founded not on genes, but on an ideal, an egalitarian ideal that came out of the 1600s, out of the 17th century thinkers of the Enlightenment, of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, and frankly in the 18th century, Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and those guys who were also, I think, Enlightenment thinkers and writers. And we can change over time, and we have. Radically. I mean, there was a time in this country when lynchings were happening against Italian Catholics. Catholics were being lynched. There was a time in this country when the Irish were viewed as an inferior race, and there were books being published in the 1850s and 1860s about the crime gene that the Irish had, because so many of them came over after the potato famine and they were dirt poor, and so, oh geez, look at that, all this crime. I mean, we have always adapted and grown. Our society has always been multicultural, and this is an opportunity for us to get better, not worse. Let's go forward, not be afraid.
But Tom, what if, and I have to admit, I'm a human. Everybody would like us. Everybody wants everyone to be like them for the most part. All Jewish people would love this country to be nothing but Jews.
I don't think that's true.
Well, I do. All Christians would like nothing but Christians. All atheists would like nothing but atheists. I am concerned that in 20, 30 years from now, this country, and I admit, I am guilty of saying, okay, that now that I'm here, let's raise the drawbridge. I have to admit that, as many people would if they weren't so politically correct.
Sure.
Now, fault me because I like the color blue rather than the color red, but that's just objective. But you know what? I don't want my children to grow up in a society that has now changed so much with the Muslims. As peaceful as they may be, they will eventually take over and start to infiltrate the control.
But if you look at the history of Islamic societies, John, just over the last 100 years or so, since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, what you see is that, with the exception of when we go in and invade, that they tend to be very secular. That Saddam Hussein was running a secular country. It was more secular than the United States. There was a large and well-protected Jewish community in Iraq. There was a large and well-protected Christian community. Shia and Sunni were marrying each other and living together in the same neighborhoods. In fact, that's one of the problems that we're having now that we ignited this war between the Shia and the Sunni, is that there were these huge chunks of Baghdad that were denominational, I guess is what you would call it. And because he was running a secular country. He was not about religion. And the majority of Muslims are not, gung-ho, just like the majority of Christians aren't like Terry Jones.
Well, that's where apathy comes in, because you can believe that, but I don't believe it. Because
I believe it because I've been in those parts of the world, and I've seen it.
Well, Saddam Hussein could have a secular country because he was a dictator in control. He allowed those people just enough influence. If they were going to take over, it wouldn't have been the same story.
The place where what you're describing has some accuracy is in Saudi Arabia when the first King Saud, back in the 1930s, I think it was, cut a deal with the guy, Mr. Wahhab or whatever his name was, who started Wahhabism, and basically he said, we will tolerate you and even financially support you if you will support us against everybody else, because they were Sunnis and there was a lot of Shia who were living in the desert out there where the oil fields were. And he made basically a deal with the devil. He did the same thing as if Ronald Reagan had said to Jerry Falwell, we're basically going to turn over all religious education in the country to you. We're going to turn the schools over to you, and not even Jerry Falwell isn't even extreme enough. Some total right-wing Christian extremist. And a fringe cult at that, maybe the polygamist Mormons or something, and who are totally and assuming that they were totally evangelical, but the reality is that most people, whether they're Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, whatever they may be, their main interest is feeding their family, having housing, having a decent job, knowing that their kids can go to school, knowing that there's going to be a decent future. And regardless of the percentage of Muslims or Christians or Catholics or we had these battles about Catholics and Protestants in this country in the last half of the 19th century. We had these debates at the time of the founding of this country. There were no Catholics involved. It was like no Catholics allowed, right? And certainly very few Jews were allowed. We have grown through that, and we can absorb, frankly, moderate Islam into the United States. In fact, we already have. There's millions of Muslims in the United States who are peaceful, and they may be practicing their religion the way that people who go to church on Sunday practice their religion, but they are not out there saying, in your face and mine, saying, you must convert.
We'll give it time, Tom. So 20, 30 years from now, we'll look back and think we were foolish and apathetic, and that's what will happen.
Well, John, I just have to say, history doesn't demonstrate that. What history demonstrates is that religions, after they go through their crazy phase, people wake up and say, we don't want to have anything to do with the crazy phase anymore. We don't want the bloodshed. We don't want the violence. We don't want the oppression. We went through that in the United States in the 1600s, the late 1600s, in the state of Massachusetts, where they were hanging women for being witches. And we finally said, enough. And Thomas Jefferson authored the Virginia Declaration of Freedom of Religion. In fact, it's on his tombstone. It's one of the 3 things on his tombstone that he was most proud of. And Massachusetts was still persecuting women. It's the reason why Ben Franklin left his home in his birthplace in Massachusetts and went to Philadelphia, was to get away from the religious crazies in the early 1700s. And, we've been through it here. The British went through it with Cromwell. The history of every country, if you look at it, is that when there are reactive religious outbreaks and cycles, that the pendulum swings back. And John, I just don't think that we may go through. We may well go through a crazy phase, but I don't think it's going to last, because it never has.
Now. The pendulum is swinging now, and for which people are being criticized. The pendulum is now swinging. That's what's happening now. And,
sure.
Hopefully so.
It is, and I think that what pushed it was Bush's response to 9/11.
Well, maybe that was what was necessary to get people to quit.
No, that was absolutely unnecessary. It was the most stupid thing that could be done. It was only necessary to turn George Bush from a president who had lousy approval ratings that most people believed was not elected but was appointed by the Supreme Court and was not legitimate, into a superhero. He had to create an anti-hero. He had to create a Lex Luthor so that he could be Superman, and he did that with Osama bin Laden. Instead of calling him out as a crazy guy who only had 20,000 followers at the most, and at the most, and who had been kicked out. You know, bin Laden had been kicked out of his own country, and they had stripped him of his Saudi citizenship because he tried to get a merry band, you know, after the war in Afghanistan was over, after Ronald Reagan successfully paid Osama bin Laden to fight the Soviets. After that was over, bin Laden went back to Saudi Arabia and said, you know, this guy Saddam Hussein on our southeastern border, this guy lets women wear pants and teach in colleges and work as doctors. That's wrong. We need to invade his country. And Osama bin Laden gathered together a couple thousand soldiers, and they massed on the border of Iraq, and they were going to invade Iraq. And the Saudis looked at that and said, this is crazy. We don't want to have a war with Iraq. And they arrested him, they stripped him of his cititizenship, and they deported him to Sudan, which is where his mother was from, and said, enough already of this stuff. I mean, it's even though the Saudis who tolerated the Wahhabists didn't want this kind of insanity. So, John, I just, you know, I get it that you're concerned and maybe even afraid, and many Americans are. But the reality is, when you look at history, and you look at the history of religions and governments and peoples, that eventually people wake up, and they tend to be more sane than insane.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.